Jerry Jones once referred to one of the Packers' defensive coordinator candidates as Winston Churchill on a football field. Jerry, you're from Texas. I'm from Wisconsin. I don't think either one of us is in much of a position to be critiquing other people's accents. Just saying. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Lombardi Time Brews, where I'm your host, John Delray. The Green Bay Packers have begun making calls. In fact, according to what timing you believe, they may have already conducted a couple of interviews for their open defensive coordinator position. At this time, we know of at least 4 individuals that it has been confirmed that are being considered for the position. And we're going to get to all of them. And there's some real differences between these 4. One of them's unemployed. 3 currently do have jobs with other teams, as position coaches, defensive underlings, what have you. There's also some very different schemes being looked at by Matt LaFleur. One thing that they do all have in common, they're all young. Joe Barry was 53 years old, which by coaching standards isn't even ancient. But the 4 candidates that are getting interviewed thus far for the Packers, one has an age of 41, 40, 44, and then a young whippersnapper at 32 years of age. So I'm going to dive into those 4 candidates, talk about what type of system they would be expecting to run, what their current job is, how it seems like they've done, some pros and cons, etc. We're going to go into all 4 of those. But before we get there, I do want to mention that given the wide-reaching scope of these 4 candidates, it does look quite likely as though Matt LaFleur is casting a wide net. So I do not pretend as though these 4 individuals are 4 finalists for the position. This is the beginning of the process. These are just 4 interviews that have already been conducted or are in process of being scheduled. Keep in mind, too, this also could get further complicated if Matt LaFleur wants any one of the candidates on any of the final 4 teams in the NFL, being the Ravens, Niners, Lions, Chiefs. If he wants to interview any of them, it gets further complicated from a scheduling standpoint as well. So this is just the beginning of the process. Also, Dan Granziano of ESPN, he put out a list of names this morning that he either believes or has been told Green Bay will be interested in talking to. And his list included Aubrey Pleasant of the LA Rams, Chris Harris of the Titans, Jim Leonard, Wink Martindale, and Brandon Staley, the former Charger coach. So where that came from, not entirely sure, but it's either from sources or himself. But either way, that's the list that got put out just this morning before interviews started being announced. Also, in regards to Brandon Staley, yes, he is one of the 4 that I'm going to talk about shortly. He is getting an interview. And it should be noted, too, that Rob Domofsky of ESPN, the Packers beat reporter, said 2 days ago that it doesn't look like Staley is going to be in serious consideration for the job. So who knows anything at this point? What we do have to go on is just 4 individuals gotten interviews, and we can dive in and take a look at who they are and what they've done. Those 4 individuals are Christian Parker, Aiden Durde, Bobby Babich, and Brandon Staley. So let's start with perhaps the most surprising of the bunch, maybe the most under the radar name, Aiden Durde, 44 years old, current job. He's the defensive line coach of the Dallas Cowboys, where he's been since 2021. A little bit of background about him. He is British. He's from across the sea. He got his start playing in NFL Europe for 6 years before taking over as the head of player development for NFL UK. He then spent 3 years in Atlanta as a defensive assistant under head coach Dan Quinn, eventually ascending to outside linebackers coach. When Dan Quinn was fired in Atlanta and moved to Dallas to become the DC, Durde followed and became the Cowboys defensive line coach, working with DeMarcus Lawrence and Micah Parsons, obviously having a good level of success working with them. And you can tell already, yes, Durde is very, very much a Quinn protege. When Quinn was let go in Atlanta, he followed him right to Dallas. They found him a new job. These 2 are close. Okay. And so I'm going to say, in terms of projecting a scheme, let's go with Dan Quinn. It's just kind of assumed. Now, maybe Durde would have some spins on it, but being a protege of very much one scheme in your entire coaching career does generally put you in that. So what that really means is there would be a 4-3 base set, lots of nickel mixed in, and heavy on man coverage. In terms of whether anyone else is courting him, there are a couple teams. The Falcons have requested an interview with Durde, as have the Rams. It also should be noted that this could get massively complicated if Dan Quinn does get one of the head coaching jobs still available, such as Seattle, Washington. If Dan Quinn gets one of those jobs, it's believed he may very well bring Durde along as his defensive coordinator. Also, if Quinn gets one of those jobs, Dallas may want to retain Durde as their defensive coordinator. So this is a man, even though his name is predominantly flown under the radar, this is a man who very much by NFL teams is being looked at seriously for defensive coordinator positions, and Green Bay is right there. So let's go over some pros and cons. Pro, if you're looking for a more aggressive scheme, or you believe that the Packers should switch to a 4-3 base, or even 4-2-5 for their nickel implementation, then this is probably one of the guys for you. He's also received accolades for being a great and patient teacher. You don't become the head of development for NFL UK. He also had a hand in developing the international pathway program for the NFL, which is another major accolade. By all accounts, this man is a great teacher. However, the cons. While being a direct protege is one thing, Durde, he's never been a run game coordinator, never been a defensive pass game coordinator. He's been a position coach for 2 different spots, but there doesn't seem to be a whole world of diversification there from a coaching standpoint. Nonetheless, though, if he is just going to run Quinn's scheme, if he's a great character coach, you could obviously do a lot worse. And the fact that so many teams are considering him, I do consider to be a positive thing. It means, at least in NFL circles, this guy is well known for doing great work. On to the next candidate. That would be someone we actually know, Christian Parker. 32 years old, current job is the defensive backs coach in Denver. He started out in Green Bay. Under Matt LaFleur, he was a defensive quality control coach in 2019 and 2020 when Mike Patton was defensive coordinator. Then he was named the defensive backs coach in Denver, where he's been for the last 3 years. Very interestingly about Parker, he has survived 3 different defensive play callers in Denver. You know, like when new coaches come in, they always like to have their own guys, right? Or maybe it's insistent by an owner or GM that they stick with what's. Parker's survived not just once, 3 different defensive play callers, which I feel is quite noteworthy, especially at his young age. Those 3 play callers would have been Vic Fangio in 2021, Giro Evero in 2022, and current coordinator Vance Joseph this last year. When asked about Parker, Vance Joseph refers to him as a star. He also noted that his players love playing for him and that he works his butt off. In his 3 years in Denver alone, he's worked with Justin Simmons and Patrick Surtain, which is not a bad resume for being so young. And plus, dude's a coach's coach, like meaning that he basically got a coaching job as soon as he possibly could. He was hired for the first time as a coach at age 21. He became a defensive quality control coach in Green Bay at the age of 27. Theo Epstein, right? Or like there's so many others in all sports of just these wonderkins, young guys who just seemingly get it and ascend the ranks so quickly. By all accounts, it looks like Christian Parker is one. In terms of a projected scheme, it's believed that he would employ a variation of the Fangio scheme, perhaps the more modern version used by Evero, or a hybrid pushing together some of what he's learned under Patton and Fangio. Regardless, lots of 3-4, lots of 2-4-5. And we're going to talk about why that's so important for Parker in just a little bit, like why it seems so likely that he would pluck from different coaching trees, different philosophies to build one defensive scheme. It's very much a thing in his personality. In terms of anyone else courting him, he has interviewed for the New England Patriots, for Gerard Mayo, for their defensive coordinator position as well. Here are the pros. Honestly, it feels like Matt LaFleur trying to hit a home run, trying to get a boy genius into the position, right? It feels like LaFleur is looking back at a guy and saying, like, I had him, and I'm thankful that he went out, got some more experience because I adore the guy, and now let's bring him home. Young, innovative, fresh. You know, it also maybe is a titch of like LaFleur saying, hey, missed out on Evero last time because I went with someone with more experience. Not going to do that again if, of course, they decide to hire Parker. Smart is smart, regardless of age. Also should be noted that Parker seems to really want to embody the beliefs of who he works for. And this is a little bit of what I was getting to. If you go listen to his interviews, several of them across the Denver Broncos site and other places, he always refers to who he is working for and the priorities that they have in their teachings, referring to Sean Payton, Vance Joseph, just from minicamp interviews from this last year. He's a guy who really seems to want to learn from who he's under. And he was asked directly about, hey, you've been here 3 years, 3 different people in charge of you. Like, how does that feel? How hard has that been? And he goes, it's been a blessing because he can learn from them. Christian Parker has made it known that someday he wants to be a head coach. And he seemingly is taking every opportunity to learn from every human he can how to be better at the job. Generally, that's a pretty good thing for a coach. What are the cons? What are the concerns? Dude's 32. He's a baby. He's coached one position. I mean, he did defensive quality control, but then he's been D-backs in Denver. That's it. It's not like it's been 3 years at 3 different spots. I really do like the diversification of being under 3 different play callers. Could make for a really cool hybrid defensive plan. But ultimately, he still has only ever worked with defensive backs. Is he ready for the schematic nuance that comes with being a full-on coordinator? Lots of smart people seem to think that he might be, and maybe he is, but there is some valid reason to be cautious when looking at such a limited resume, even if it is incredibly advanced. Candidate number 3, that would be Bobby Babich. He is 40 years old, currently the linebacker coach for the Buffalo Bills under Sean McDermott. He has spent 7 years in Buffalo, previously doing safeties and the assistant to defensive backs. Before getting to Buffalo, he spent time with Carolina and Cleveland, again as assistant defensive backs coach. It's believed, in terms of projecting a scheme, that he would do part of the Leslie Frazier, Sean McDermott philosophy. Leslie Frazier, of course, was previously the defensive coordinator in Buffalo. McDermott, of course, the head coach. It probably would be 4-3 with high levels of zone and varied blitz packages. In terms of who else is courting him, he has interviewed or been requested to interview for the Giants and Dolphins for their defensive coordinator positions. Pros. By all accounts, the guy seems beloved in Buffalo, to the point of several Bills fans even online calling for him to become the new defensive coordinator. And even in Miami, they were stoked when it was announced that he was going to be interviewing. He also has family bloodlines. His father was a coach in the NFL for 20 years. And his work stands out on its own, having worked with Matt Milano and Tremaine Edmonds, elevating their game over the recent years. Part of the reason for his success could very well be in his own staunch beliefs. There's one really cool interview that if you go look back, he basically is talking about how some guys are really big, but they don't play like it. And other guys are little and they play big. So he says when he watches film, he tries basically to just like picture shadows out there, and he's not taking into account their measurables. The tape rules all. And he is going to judge the guys, put them in positions to succeed, figure out what they can and can't do, not based upon their size, not based upon anything like that, but based upon what they do on the field. In terms of cons, he's got slightly varied experience at positions, but like others on this list, lacks any type of coordination. No pass coordinator, no run coordinator. He's been a position coach. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does open itself to at least some risk, as all first-time hires do. All right, now the next guy, in terms of not being a first-time hire, and I know this is a very, very polarizing candidate for Green Bay Packer fans. Brandon Staley, 41 years old, formerly the head coach of the Chargers, formerly the defensive coordinator of the Rams. He is currently unemployed, and I did kind of pick that picture for a reason because he looks stern. It's kind of been his face a lot over the last few years when he's been head coach for the Chargers. His background, he is a direct disciple of Vic Fangio. He worked as an outside linebacker coach for Fangio on 2 different teams before getting his own coordinating job for the Rams in 2020. In that 1 year, though, it was a brilliant year. 2020, as the Rams defensive coordinator, they were the #1 defense in the NFL in both points allowed and yards allowed. At the time, he was considered a meteoric riser, going from outside linebacker coach to now this wonderkind of a defensive coordinator that he soon got a head coaching job for the Los Angeles Chargers. And he was there from 2021 through week 15 of this last year before getting thumped by the Raiders' rookie quarterback. The defensive statistics for Staley were less than stellar with the Chargers over his 2+ years at the helm, and many consider his tenure, in spite of the promise and the excitement when he was first hired, and his analytics-driven approach that some people just adore. Now, looking back, it's considered pretty much an outright failure. In terms of projecting a scheme, yeah, it's Fangio all the way, similar to Joe Barry. Lots of deep quarter match stuff direct from Fangio, but perhaps even more conservative, someone like a Joe Barry. In terms of anyone else courting him, the Dolphins, they're interviewing him for their defensive coordinator job, as are the Rams, seeing if maybe he could come back there now that Raheem Morris has departed to Atlanta. Okay, there's some things to break down here. What are the pros to Brandon Staley? I mean, the dude was revered as an upcoming genius for a reason. He's very analytically driven. He did coordinate a #1 defense, and not barely #1. They were the most dominant defense by a mile that year. Even as a head coach, I know that the reputation now is terrible, but as a head coach, his total record was still 500. So there are some good things here. He was considered a defensive genius. And look at the teams that are interested in him. All 3 teams that are looking and interviewing him just happen to be playoff teams. Okay, but the cons, when he coordinated that Rams defense, it's a fairly concerning argument to wonder if it was the coach or the players who led the charge to such a dominant year. He had Aaron Donald and Jalen Ramsey. That's a heck of a way to start a defensive coordinating career. Now, in Green Bay, he would have Kenny Clark, Jair, at the exact same positions, really. But he had stars with the Chargers, too, and he never could quite coordinate that defense to success in spite of being the play caller. And then I have 2 other major concerns here. It appeared as though the Chargers this year just straight up quit on him. His final press conferences were filled with consternation, the appearance of a man overwhelmed by his circumstances. And then I also have a concern about the scheme itself. I've mentioned earlier that, so many teams are getting away from the Fangio way of doing things, the Fangio tree, the Fangio philosophy. So many teams are getting away from that because in the last couple of years, especially this year, the only 2 guys that have been able to run that scheme with any type of success has been Vic Fangio himself or Ejiro Evero, who's done some real modern wrinkles to continue to update it and in some ways make it more complex. Brandon Staley hasn't done that as much and is kind of on the Joe Barry side of things over what we've most recently seen. That is a concern. But look, here's my thoughts on this. Okay, I know a lot of people are angry about the idea that he's getting an interview at all, that he's even being remotely considered by Matt LaFleur. And I get it. But there were lots of people who really have been brilliant coordinators who were terrible as head coaches, especially when they're young. There have been plenty of coaches who, once they get a second shot at being a head coach, actually do well. The first time was just a failure for a number of different reasons, potentially underestimating how much job there is to do. And maybe Brandon Staley would fit the bill. He was revered early on in his Chargers head coaching career. Yes, he was analytically driven, but at the same time, per a number of analytic reviews, he was known as the guy always making the correct decisions. It's just a matter of whether they worked or not. But in theory, they were the right things to do all the time. That's how he was revered at the beginning of his tenure with the Chargers. So by all accounts, this is a pretty smart dude. So maybe it is Staley. Maybe head coaching was just too much. Maybe he still would be a great coordinator. Maybe it's not. But from my standpoint, considering that he's not yet a finalist for the job, I think it's worth an interview. And that's my 2 cents on this. In fact, looking over the resume of all 4 of these guys, all of them, I don't see any one of the 4 that it's like, now granted, there are some surprises here, but I don't see any one of the 4 where I'm like, hey, why are they even remotely considering that? And I understand if that's your opinion on Staley. But I think it's at least worth a conversation. Ask him what the heck happened with the Chargers and how he plans on actually fulfilling his potential as a defensive play caller. So there you have it. 4 candidates for the Packers defensive coordinator job. As I said at the very beginning, there's probably more to come. I highly doubt this is it. And as we get into next week, I think we'll see more names. This could, depending again on who LaFleur wants, this could be a drawn out process. But we'll see as we start getting into second interviews, whatever else, what the rumor mill churns over the coming days. And I will be back on Monday for it to update you on what's going on with the Green Bay Packers. Hope everybody out there has an absolutely fantastic weekend. As I said, I'll be back on Monday. And until then, and as always, go Pack Go.